Hi everyone, my name is Inseni Sampson, and in this video I will be discussing the Watts Uprising of 1965. The question is, was the uprising angry chaos or purposeful response to oppression? Was the Watts Uprising a riot or a revolt? Rioting at the time was considered to be an East Coast trend, specifically in the southeast region of the United States. Yet the uprising is deemed as one of the largest revolts in U.S. history aside from slave revolts. After World War II, nearly 500,000 African Americans migrated to the West Coast in an effort to escape discrimination and racism, but they came to have found it on the West Coast as well. For many African American Los Angeles residents who lived in the Watts neighborhood, the isolation in that community confirmed that racial divide was indeed intact. Many blacks endured racial inequality as they experienced education, housing, political, and employment discrimination. In 1964, voters in California passed Proposition 14, which repealed the Rumford Fair Housing Act and legitimized housing segregation. A large number of residents interviewed by the McCone Commission complained of substandard housing, unemployment, and exploitative local business practices. The passage of Proposition 14 meant that they had fewer avenues to escape these conditions. It was a state-sanctioned message to residents of the ghettos to stay in their place. The events in Watts were a defiant rejoinder. The Watts Uprising occurred on August 11, 1965 in the Watts neighborhood of South Central Los Angeles. The uprising spurred when a young African-American male by the name Marquette Fry, who was with his brother Ronald, was pulled over and arrested by Lee Menendez, a white California highway patrolman, under the suspicion of operating a motor vehicle under the influence of alcohol. There seemed to be a strained tension between Fry and the police officer, according to onlookers. Backup was called from the LAPD, Los Angeles Police Department, and more officers arrived. When Renee Frey, the mother of two boys, emerged to the incident, a struggle ensued, leading to the LAPD arresting all three of the Frys, and this enraged the crowd of onlookers. Within half an hour, the residents of the Watts neighborhood took to the streets. The Watts neighborhood held a meeting the day after the Frys were arrested, called by the Los Angeles County Commission in an effort to quell the mounting tension. However, it failed and rioting resumed later that night. The rioting took place over a course of 6 days. Residents threw bottles, bricks, and rocks at the police cars after the Frys were initially arrested. They targeted white-owned businesses in their community, the same businesses that interviewees told the commission marked up goods, sold rotten groceries, and were hostile to black customers. Meanwhile, many black-owned businesses avoided the violence by putting up Bud Brothers signs in their windows, indicating their solidarity with the demonstrators. This fact, coupled with a large number of residential properties and public places such as pools and parks that were left untouched, suggests that participants in the Watts events were, after a fashion, disciplined and focused. Over the course of 6 days, automobiles were overturned and burned, grocery stores, liquor stores, department stores, and pawn shops were looted and damaged. Riots intensified as days went on, prompting the California Lieutenant Governor to call the California National Guard, mobilizing 14,000 troops to South Central Los Angeles in an attempt to restore public order. Curfew was instated within a 25-mile zone. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. cut his trip to Puerto Rico short and arrived to Los Angeles when the riots were largely over and curfew had been lifted. While deploring the riots and the use of their violence, King was quick to point out the problems that led to the violence were environmental and not racial. The economic deprivation, social isolation, inadequate housing, and general despair of thousands of Negroes teeming in northern and western ghettos are ready seeds which give birth to tragic expressions of violence. California Governor Edmund Brown urged King not to go to Watts, yet King went to support those living in the ghetto. He claimed would be pushed further into despair and hopelessness by the riot. King also hoped to bolster the frayed alliance between blacks and whites favoring the civil rights reform. He offered to mediate between the local people and government officials and push for systematic solutions to the economic and social problems of plaguing Watts and other black ghettos. King's efforts of mediation between the local government and the African American community is a direct depiction of nonviolent direct action. However, in the wake of the violent atrocities having already occurred in the South Central Los Angeles neighborhood, it was difficult to erect a social change. Collective violence already took a distinctly different shape in the 18th century neighborhood. It was difficult to erect a social change. Collective violence already took a a distinctly different shape in the 18th century, according to Tilly. Essentially, Tilly believed that there were multiple key currents of social change that allowed for this reshape of violence, which included creation of specialized police force, which imposed a tighter control over a routine social life in every aspect of life. This was apparent when the National Guard was called and curfew was instated. The second key current was the shift towards violent political outbursts, which increased everyone's anger and outrage. The uprising itself was an example of this. Third, residents turned away from legal authorities due to the lack of protection from a large scale of things. An example of this would be the government supporting segregation. Fourth, bargaining through the use of violence. The uprising was fueled by the discrimination that African Americans faced in all arrays of life. King told reporters that the Watts riots were the beginning of the stirring of those people in our society who have bypassed by the progress of the past decade. Struggles in the North, King believed, were really about dignity and work rather than the rights which had been the main goal of black activism in the South. During his discussions with local people, King met black residents who argued for armed insurrection and others who claimed that the only way we could ever get anybody to listen to us is to start a riot. These expressions concerned King, and before he left Los Angeles, he spoke on the phone with President Lyndon B. Johnson about what could be done to ease the situation. King recommended that Johnson roll out a federal anti-property program in Los Angeles immediately. Later that fall, King wrote an article for the Saturday Review in which he argued that Los Angeles could have anticipated rioting. When its officials tied up federal aid and political manipulation, when the rate of Negro unemployment soared above the Depression levels of the 1930s, when the population density of Watts became the worst in the nation, and when the state of California repealed a law that prevented discrimination in housing. After the SCLC initiated the Chicago campaign that fall, King asked the audience there, what did Watts accomplish with the deaths of 34 Negroes and injure thousands more? What did it profit that the Negro to burn down the stores and factories in which he sought employment? The way of riots is not the way of progress, but a blind alley of death and destruction which wreaks the havoc hardest against rioters themselves.
Six days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. More than 100 square blocks were decimated by fire and looters, and few buildings were left intact. Firemen were harassed by snipers and brick-throwing hoodlums as they attempted to control the fires, many of which were left to burn themselves out. As the National Guard moved in to restore comparative calm, the losses by fire alone were put at $200 million. No attempt has yet been made to estimate the losses suffered at the hands of the looters who stole everything from liquor to playpens. Firemen were later issued flak suits of bulletproof mesh to protect them from snipers who continued to shoot from rooftops. Nearly 3,000 were arrested, and authorities had to open abandoned jails to house those netted by the police. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlums. Civil rights leaders were quick to deplore the unbridled lawlessness, and Martin Luther King vowed to do all in his power to prevent a recurrence in Los Angeles or anywhere. An uneasy calm prevails in what is known as the Watts area of the city. A curfew was put into effect, and the entire section declared off limits to all but residents. The people who live here are suffering great hardship with no grocery, drug, or other service stores able to operate. A special task force of 1,000 policemen stays on the alert as the thousands of guardsmen patrol an area of 35 square miles. The outbreak spread to other Southern California cities, but were quickly quelled. In Los Angeles, authorities say they are now ready to move with dispatch if lawlessness breaks out anew. The riots in Los Angeles have written a sorrowful page in American history.